Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Ariel Leonard, and we're tuning in today for Dr. Professor Mom. Today, I have a really special guest, Dr. Robin Brewer from the University of Michigan, who recently just got tenure. So now she's associate professor. And today's conversation, a lot of people have been reaching out to me about going through the tenure process. How has it been, getting tenure? And I have not achieved tenure yet. So I thought it would be a good idea to have someone who has went through the tenure process and really has had a really nice career to kind of show you the different things that she's done throughout her time. And we'll jump right into it. So Robin and I met, oh my gosh, that was 2011.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or maybe 2010 even.
You know what? It was 2010 because I wasn't 21 yet.
Mhm, mhm.
We met in 2010 at the University of Southern California, had this like recruiting event called Reach. Wasn't it called Reach?
I think so.
Yep, we met each other then, and we have been friends ever since. Robin has been at some of my most precious moments in my life, from baby showers to weddings, to parties. So we've been in each other's lives for a very long time. And it just goes to show you like how you build community within academia. And even though we are in completely different areas, as you'll hear today, we've really done a good job at maintaining that connection to each other. So Robin, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself and we'll go forward.
Okay, sounds good. Well, first, I want to start off by saying there's no doubt that you will receive tenure whenever you do go up. But a little bit about myself. I am Dr. Robin Brewer. I am a recently tenured, so moving from assistant to associate professor at the University of Michigan in the School of Information. I study aging and accessibility in the context of human computer interaction. So I basically ask, how can we design technology not just for older adults and disabled communities, but how can we design for our future selves? What we want to see as we age in the world, what we want to see as we're likely to acquire some type of age-related disability, what should be some boundaries on technology use, what are some opportunities. So that's a bit about myself.
Okay. So give us a little bit of your background. Like, how did you get interested in science and engineering? Like, where did you go to undergrad, grad school? Like, give us a little bit of that.
That is a great question. How did I get interested in science and engineering? I think it was maybe an unconscious. I need to ask my parents this, and if it was an unconscious or conscious push by my parents
Mm,
to get more in the computing domain. I remember we had a computer when I was younger, and I would gravitate towards it to play like Barbie fashion designer or math blasters or type
yeah.
those types of games. And then at some point, when the computer started to break down, which it inevitably did back in the 90s, early
Oh,
2000s,
that gateway. Did you have gateway?
yes, all
We
the
had a gateway. Yep. We had a gateway.
had a gateway with
Mhm.
dial up internet. Things went wrong all the time, right?
Yes.
So they would let me, at some point, would let me start to try to troubleshoot and diagnose the problem and fix the computer. So I think that's where I started interest. And I don't know, because both of them were in more IT fields, even though they had no type of IT background before getting into their then job. Um, they were pushing me towards that. So I went to a science and technology high school. I'm from Maryland, Prince George's County, Maryland, PG County,
No.
and went to a science and tech high school where we basically had to declare some type of STEM related major, quote unquote,
Mhm.
after your freshman year. So I chose computer science, and I did my undergrad in computer science at the University of Maryland, College Park. I did research while I was an undergraduate student, and I liked it so much that I wanted to go into industry as a user experience researcher. So be the one that tells the designers and the
Mhm.
programmers what it is that they should build and what it is they should design based off of interviewing or surveying or doing focus groups with people. I really like that interaction, human interaction aspect.
Mm,
So after undergrad, I started a PhD program in human centered computing. I actually did well in the program, but I did not like it. So I left and I started another PhD program at Northwestern University. Um, where I had to completely start over, right? I had
yeah.
to start classes over. I had finished classes, passed all my qualifying exams where I was before, but nothing transferred to Northwestern.
Yeah.
So I had to start over, which was a journey, especially mentally when you think you are completely done with coursework and then you have to start coursework again.
Yeah. And like, let's pause on that. Like,
Mhm.
because so many we have, I have a lot of graduate students that watch, or even postdocs that watch Dr. Professor Mom. And I do get the question sometimes of, I'm in this department or this organization and I'm not really liking it, whether it be the research, whether it be the advisor. Um, or just the environment in general, they don't care for it and they want to move to a different institution. But it's like you said, hey, like I've went through this program, I passed quals, like it's, I got a few years and now I'm about to start over. What really made you say, hey, like, even though I'm going to have to start over, this is the best decision for me? Like, what was that? What was your thought process in really making that decision to not only start over, but then move, right? You moved from Maryland all the way to Chicago or Evanston.
Right. It was difficult. I was having some advisor issues where I was, and so I first tried to switch advisors.
Okay.
And even though that advisor had nothing to do with, well, first of all, that advisor had nothing to do with my research that I switched to. So that I already saw that as being a little bit difficult. They were in the human computer interaction space, but they weren't doing research related to
Mm,
aging. So I thought, okay, that's going to be difficult. But also, that person was extremely busy. It was hard for me to even meet with them, get them to
yeah.
respond to an email without having to resend it many times. And I said, you know what? Let's just explore what my options can be. I know I
Okay.
could stay in this program. I passed the coursework and the exams. I could stay and make it work, but could I find something better? And I was
Yeah.
able to do that. Now it was difficult, like you said. I moved, had to start over, not just academically, but socially as well, because had been in Maryland my entire life. Most of the people that I hung out with outside of the grad program were people that I had grown up with from diapers or went to undergrad with. And then I moved to Chicago. Actually, Northwestern is in Evanston, which is a little rural for me. So I lived in
The fact
Chicago.
that you think that Evanston is rural just lets me know that you were born and raised in the city.
Yes, right. It was a little extreme for me. So I lived in Chicago for the 4 years that I did my PhD at
Hmm.
Northwestern, but I didn't know anyone there. I didn't have any family. I think the closest family was about 4 hours away in Cincinnati. So it was restarting socially, which I think ended up being good for me to
Yeah.
get me out of my comfort zone and my shell and to force me to join all the organizations and meet
Yeah.
people and go out. So I think that was actually not only a good move academically, but also a good move um, socially.
It's like I tell my undergrads here, when they are looking at jobs or graduate school, the next step, I'm like, hey, it's beneficial to go somewhere else, right? To experience a different place. It pushes you outside of your comfort zone. You grow, you evolve, and so it's very important to kind of step outside of your immediate area. Like you said, you've been in that area you've been in Maryland your entire life. So now that you're an academic, so the title of this episode is thriving and not just surviving, because I feel, and I'm sure for the same for you, Robin, because you and I have had so many conversations. When you're going into tenure track positions, even the current assistant professors, full professors, they make you feel like this, you're going to always be in survival mode, right? That you're not really going to be able to enjoy like these next like 5 years, you're going to have very little enjoyment, very little happiness, right? It's just going to be surviving from semester to semester. And so I feel that, when I look at mine, I just started my 5th year at OSU in January, and I feel like I have been thriving, right? I don't feel like I've been in this kind of survival mode rat race that people, I would say would tell us, right? Like you're just going to be in survival mode. For you, what do you consider what is thriving to you as an assistant professor? Like what would you consider thriving?
For me, thriving in academia means minimizing this notion of a rat race, right?
Yeah.
And this exhaustion. That was something that had actually steered me away from academia to begin with. I shocked maybe the world when I said to my advisor, "Oh, I think I'm going to apply to some postdocs and some tenure track
Mhm.
positions." She was not expecting that because, as I had mentioned, I initially started the PhD to go into industry research. And so I had tons of internships and everything seemed fun at internships, right? Whereas when I went back to the university setting, all of the other faculty professors around me were seemed so stressed out. They were
Yeah.
always complaining about something. And I took that as a sign as, oh, I don't want to be in this environment. So I think thriving in academia means minimizing that exhaustion, minimizing that rat race notion, while still having time to pursue interests outside of your work. But at the same time, still being recognized within your scholarly community. So there's a balance
Right.
between
Yep.
you have to be the number one person in your community, the go
Yep.
to for everything, versus people know what you do. They respect
Yeah.
what you do. When they want to cite whatever, they know to cite you or to call you up if they're doing this type of grant or send an email for this type of collaboration. So they know what you do, but you don't have to, that doesn't have to be your primary identity.
And I like that you said that about the identity piece because I think so many young academics, and I mean, I was guilty of it in grad school too, right? Where you think like the most important thing that you're doing is this research. And that's not really the most important thing that you're doing. You want to have an identity outside of that. And I feel like and it's I think that's the issue with academics or just like overachievers in general. Like so much of your worth is tied to how well you're doing in your job, right? And especially research, right? Am I publishing in the top journals? Like am I on track to be like a Nobel laureate? I remember a junior faculty was like, I'm going to be a Nobel laureate. I was like, that's great. But even if you're not, you're probably still going to do amazing things, right? And so I think it is true that I think the older generation really pushes that big, because even if I remember saying to older professors, like, well, I may want to do like, for a sabbatical, I may want to do something more like education policy related. And they're like, oh no, like if it was me, I would, go to a top research institution and really like go into my research. And I'm like, well, that's you, right? So I think the newer generation is kind of redefining what it means to be an academic and what it really means to thrive, while also accepting that the definition of thriving is very different for everyone. Now, there's some things that you just have to have, right? And we'll talk about that later, but there's some things that just has to be there. But the idea of thriving just means very different things, and that's okay too, right? For different people. So when you look back on your time as an assistant professor, especially when you first started, what were some of the biggest surprises or challenges that you encountered?
I think one of the biggest challenges for me, and I'm going to frame this as a challenge, but it's also a good thing, was that I couldn't say yes to everything that I thought was exciting,
That's
right? As a grad student, my advisor was always saying, hey, you got to focus. Because I was still that person that would like to, go to this conference or volunteer for that thing or start this other project. And she said, you could do those things when in your next career role. So I thought, okay, I'm now in my next career role. All the
Mm,
things that I wanted to do. I think also starting at a place like the University of Michigan, where it is a very large university, and people were excited that I was here. So they were inviting me to collaborate on a lot of things. I was saying yes to almost everything because I said, oh, that sounds cool. That sounds exciting. But then you realize you are soon working on 10, 15 different
Yeah.
projects and you're spreading yourself too thin, even on things that you enjoy doing. So that was one. And then I think the other thing that I had not realized was just how much time teaching took,
Yes.
especially in my first year. So as a grad student, I was not an instructor of record. I was basically a teaching assistant for one class. And then I had led a couple week programs for undergrad students and for some high school students. But that's very different from teaching a semester long
Yeah.
course, being the instructor of record. My first year on tenure track was 2019. And so that meant fall of 2019, the class that I was teaching was very different from when I taught it in fall of 2020, which was also very different from fall of 2021. So I
Yeah.
basically had to re-prep a class, which I was already doing basically a new prep for anyway. Had to do a new prep and then re-prep it 2 times after that for completely different modalities of in-person only to online
Yeah.
only to hybrid. And that was a lot of work.
It
And I
is. Yeah.
realized the amount of time. So when you describe if you're the first academic in your family, like I am, you say, "Oh, I'm a professor here." They instantly ask, "What do you teach?"
What do you
And
teach?
tell
Yeah.
them, even though teaching is not the majority of the role, right?
Right.
But
It's very little of the role.
exactly. And then they also ask, "Oh, well, how many classes do you teach this semester?" I said,
One.
"Well, one." They say, "Oh, that's it. You must have plenty of free time." No, not at all. Once you count the time it takes to prep, to create the assignments, to grade the assignments, to answer student emails, office hours, one class could just be, 8 to 10 hours of your time, 8 hours of your time if you're not doing a new prep, and maybe more if you are doing a new prep. So I think that was what had surprised me the most of just how much teaching one class would take of my time.
I would agree, and I think I now when we have like the new faculty start and people ask like what was the biggest surprise for you, and I always say how time consuming teaching really is, especially for and then even I think for me sometimes during the class, every class is so different.
Right.
And I may have, had these assignments in 2020 and then in 2022 I can see that there's students have went through COVID, so there's a little bit of there's a difference in what they know coming in, and now I have to revamp my assignments and my lectures to kind of meet the students where they are, right? Instead of saying, "Oh, well, this is where you are, I don't care." So it is a lot. Even when you think you've taught a class 4 times, you think, "Oh, I'm not going to have to change anything." You're like, "I am changing," because they have very different backgrounds than the class a year ago, right? So it is time consuming, and it is a small part of the job because research just takes so much time, so much of your time. In
Mhm.
that same realm of thought, like what was surprising for you? Was it surprising for you that um I want to be careful saying that you don't get a lot of credit for teaching, but how little credit you get for teaching?
Yes. That was somewhat surprising because you come into new faculty orientation and they throw out these numbers of percentages of how much research, teaching, and service matters at an R1 institution. And I think it was 40, 40, 20. So you're
Yep,
like,
that's
okay,
me. Yeah.
teaching is supposed to be about the same amount of time as research. But then when you go to all of these workshops, about how to get tenure or how do you know you're ready to go up for tenure, there's a major focus on research
Yep.
and there's nothing about there, or very little about teaching. And so I had also gotten, I don't remember if this was from someone in my unit or from somewhere else, but they said you can get tenure with not being the most amazing
Yeah.
teacher.
Oh, yeah.
You cannot get tenure with being, a not so great researcher.
Yep.
So that surprised me, especially because the branding and the marketing coming out was as though they were the same. They were weighted the same, but they really are not. At least not at an R1 institution.
They're not. And it's the same thing. People here at OSU told me the same thing. You could be an okay teacher, an amazing researcher, like you're going to get tenure. If you're an amazing teacher and an okay researcher, it will be a fight. They didn't say you couldn't get it. They just said it would be a fight to get tenure because even though the percentage is 40-40-20, research is like 90.
Right. And I saw this as well with people. So teaching also includes mentoring. I
Yes.
saw this as well with cases that went up with people who were not so great mentors to their own students and had lots of cases and things against them, but they brought in lots of money or they had tons of publications, and the university would just say, interesting, we'll make a note of that. We might put them on some type of probation, but you've got tenure. So
Yeah.
that's a little problematic on its own, but also exemplifying this research really takes priority over teaching, although some of the branding might be different. And although if you're outside of academia, you might think teaching is the number one thing.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad that you said like R1 institution because and I think like the family comment is so true because even now they're like, oh, you have the summer off. You could just do whatever you want. I'm like, oh no, I don't have the summer.
Not at all.
I am very much still on, like really on. I just have more time to dedicate to research, right? But you don't technically have the summer off. And it's really because similar to you, I'm the first academic in my family. I have a cousin who is an academic, but more in like sports and things of that nature and organizational leadership. But I'm like the first that is an research, like I'm doing a lot of research and at an R1 institution. And so a lot of my family members went to more teaching focused institutions. And so that is their idea of a professor. And so there are, many different types of institutions, and there will be institutions where teaching will matter just like 100%, right? So at a teaching primary undergrad institution or it's more teaching focused institution, so it just really depends. But I will agree, I think for me too, and I would hear people say like, oh, teaching doesn't count for a lot, but I don't think I realize like when you look at percentages, it's supposed to be equal, but in reality, it's really not. So with that, like what strategies really helped you? What strategies did you use that really helped you stay on track for tenure? Like did you have like lists or goals? Like because we know that, I'm gonna be honest to anybody going in academia, it's the tenure, what it takes to get tenure is very vague. Like you have no clue and it's by design, right? So that you can't compare yourself to other people. So you don't really know, right? It's kind of these loose rules. Like, well, you should have this, you should have that. But for you, like, what really helped you stay on track for tenure?
That is a lovely question because, as you mentioned, that there are these invisible rules or invisible numbers that
Mhm.
people will not say out loud. So I remember when I started, I asked people, "Oh, how many publications do you need a year to get tenure?" And no one would give me a number.
Yep.
Now, mind you, I'm in a school of information, which is very interdisciplinary, where some people might spend all of their time pre-tenure writing a book, and that is their major
Interesting.
output. Other people might have one high visibility journal article a year or every other year, and that is their ticket to tenure. Other people might publish 10 papers a year, and then that is seen as on track. So I get why they didn't tell me a number because we can literally be in the same unit and be doing very different things in terms of
Right.
output. But it was very frustrating for me because I like to have a goal and say, all right, I'm going to work towards this specific goal. So I kind of got around that by using our annual review letter as a way to give me a number.
Mm,
So for our annual, we have an annual review each year. We submit some things about what we did, and then the deans come together and they write a letter back to you. And at the end of that letter, it says if you or below expectations, meets expectations, or exceeds expectations.
Interesting.
And
Okay, so the
so,
deans do it for you guys. For us, it's our department chair.
well,
That's
we don't have a department. We're not in a department. So we're a school with no department. So that's why it's our dean and the associate deans do.
I see. Okay. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And so after getting that letter a couple of times, I would set up a meeting with the dean and say, hey, I've been at meeting expectations. What is the range of publications for this meeting expectation? So that's where I kind of got my number for tenure without them saying this is the explicit number for tenure.
Oh, that's smart. That's really smart, right?
So
Because they're telling you, and they don't really know that they're telling you. I like this.
exactly. So you
That's a
might
good
be thinking
strategy.
numbers in other
Yeah.
ways than
Yeah.
specifically asking about tenure. So I guess that was one strategy that I used. Another was I quickly realized that they were focused not solely on quantity either,
Hmm.
because there were years that I had published one paper
Mm.
because a lot of things didn't hit, or they hit they got rejected the first year and they got accepted the next year, or I didn't have any PhD students my first year, so I was scrambling to work with
Right.
a lot of undergrads and master students and having to train them, and that took its own time. And I think that first year I got one paper, and then maybe the second year there were 2 to 3 papers. Um, but I would still be at meeting expectations.
Let's
Um,
see.
and I think it was because they were also balancing the quality of the paper venues as well. So if it was in a high visibility
Mm.
impact venue, then that was seen as better than having 5 papers at very low quality venues. So I was really focused on consistently publishing in these high quality venues while trying to get around this number that they were talking about in the annual review letters. Um, and then the other strategy was trying to communicate the impact of my work, not only in papers, but beyond papers.
Okay.
Partnering with communities, giving presentations and seminars about my work, just being more visible. I think that was helpful than the person who was just heads down, only focused on papers, never accepted any of these quote unquote extra types of opportunities. Because you do have to get your name out
Yeah,
there
you do.
for tenure. You have people, and you might talk about this later, but essentially one of the main aspects of the tenure process is that there are people who do not know you at all or have never collaborated with you, I should say. You've never co-authored anything. They have to write you a very long
Yep.
recommendation letter about the impact of your work. So you have to get that out there. So those were my 3 main strategies. But honestly, this is going to sound bad. But I didn't stress over tenure that much,
Yeah, me either. I don't stress about it.
right? Because I
Yeah.
figured at the end of the day, I had industry offers coming out of grad school, coming out of the postdoc. I could just switch to industry and make a
Yeah.
lot of money. And so if I don't get tenure, it is not the end of the world.
And that was my attitude. That is actually my attitude and has been my attitude of like, if this doesn't work out, I'm pretty sure I can get an industry job that's going to be less stressful and I'm going to make a lot more money.
Mhm.
And I'll just take my talents elsewhere because I'm like, I know I'm good, right? I'm not concerned about my abilities, right? If this is not the right career, then it's just not the right career, right? But I know that I'm very talented. So and I think that allows me to have fun in the job with and not being so stressed about, am I doing every little thing right,
Right.
because at the end of the day I'm not going to do everything right there. That's impossible, and that's impossible for anybody. So I agree with you that I took the okay, if whatever happens, right, I'm gonna let the chips fall where I'm gonna work hard and do what I know it takes to get tenure. But if this is not right for me, then it's just not good. It's just not right for me, and that's
Right.
okay too.
And I should say too that I know that you and I are in a very privileged type of field to be able to say that, especially in these STEM fields, and not everybody is in that same type of field where they can say, "Oh, I'll just pivot to this other job," and not only be able to pivot, like the jobs are there, but also make more money, right? I know that's very privileged, but it did help a lot with the comparative attitude and the stress around
Yeah.
tenure.
Yeah. Because it can be stressful, like when you mentioned, getting papers rejected. When you get papers rejected and like you have to have publications, right? Or if it's not working out with a student and you're like, well, I need to graduate a student, I need to publish with students. So there's always, like, I want to be clear too that I'm not saying, oh, anything that happened, I just let it roll off my back. But it's like I would give myself a day to, like, complain about it, and then I would, okay, moving on to the next task, because in all honesty, rejection is a big part of the job. If you have a hard time accepting rejection, this is not going to be the job for you, for sure.
Exactly. Like, I get rejected all the time. As a PhD student, I used to take it personally. I'll be like,
Right,
oh,
yeah.
I'm not meant for this. Oh, I'm a failure. Well, early as a PhD student. Later years, I said, oh, well, there's another deadline. It's fine.
Yeah, and that's how I feel too about it. So on kind of in the tenure realm, like, how did you balance? You talked a little bit about, being surprised that teaching, took so much time, realizing that research was a big part of the job. You also mentioned service, like, building community relationships with your work. How did you balance the demands of teaching, research, and service, especially in the early years?
Mm-hmm. In the early years, I'll say the first 3 years. The first year, I think I failed at the balancing of the three: research, teaching, and service,
Right.
particularly teaching and service, where I overcommitted to external service because
Hmm.
everyone was asking me things. They knew I had recently ish graduated. So they were still asking me to volunteer to do things. Now, mind you, before tenure track, I was a postdoc, so I wasn't teaching during that postdoc. And I was able to do those service things just fine. And I thought, oh, when I start tenure track
Hmm.
role, I'll still be able to do them. No, teaching takes time. And then I think maybe naturally just teaching in your first year is going to take more time. So you have to just think about that and be mindful that hopefully your unit will allow you to teach the same classes over and over. So it's not necessarily a new prep. So you do the new prep once and then you slightly tweak and iterate for a few years, unless you just really hate teaching that class. But just be mindful that that is likely to come in your very first, even second year. I was not very mindful of that. And I also thought it would become much easier in second and third year of teaching the same classes. But because, again, the COVID
Yeah.
thing, the switching modalities, it was not as easy as I had thought. Research was slow,
Hmm.
but the school told me, right, when I said I had only published one and maybe two those first 2 years, they communicated that that was their expectation, right? You're
Mm.
supposed to ease into developing a research agenda, particularly if you do not have students, or if you do happen to come in with a PhD student in your first year, they're likely not going to be very productive in their first year. You have to
Yep.
train them. So the
Maybe even
expectation,
more than their first year.
exactly, the first probably 2 to 3 years,
Two
and
to
then
3 years. Yeah.
when they
Yeah.
start to really get it and it starts to
Hmm.
click, which was the
Yep.
same with me as well.
Yeah. Me too.
My first author publication didn't come until the third year of my PhD
Same for me.
program.
Yeah.
So
Same for me.
I get it. But that was their expectation of your research is going to start out slow, ease into it. I didn't have a PhD student in my first year, so I worked with a lot of undergrad and master students, which was great, but it does take time to train them. And their turnover is much higher than a PhD student who is definitely there for 4 to 6 years, whereas
Yeah.
a master student there for 1 to 2 years. You
Yep.
train them and they're essentially gone. An undergraduate student, by the time they get to the space where they want to volunteer for research, they're usually in their third year. So they're
Yeah.
very similar to master students. You train them and then they're gone. So research was a little slow, but it does get better beyond
Yeah.
the early years.
And kind of on the research, you talked about it being slow. Like, how did you go about kind of building your research agenda or your vision for your group as an assistant professor?
That is a great question. So I was somewhat leaning into the approach that my PhD advisor had, which was if a student comes to me with a topic that is somewhat related to the topic that I do research in, I will mentor them on that project. So the building the research agenda as a research group and as a lab, it was very student
Hmm.
driven, and it still
Okay.
is that way. If students are interested in something related to aging and technology, or like more critical AI disability studies,
Interesting.
then I will say, all right, that sounds interesting. Let's figure out how we can work together on this. But in terms of my own agenda, right? So there are things that students are working on, and oftentimes that is different from the things that I am working on.
Okay.
So I built off my dissertation work, things that I wanted to do but did not do for the sake of just wanting to graduate. Open questions that I posed in discussion questions and papers from my dissertation that might also apply to other contexts that I didn't study in my dissertation work. Also, I think throughout, I started this document as an undergrad student,
Yeah.
project ideas. So, a
Okay.
list of ideas, most of which were not great. But there were a couple that I said, oh, I could see that there are themes within these types of questions. It also connects to my dissertation work. How might I move forward or propose to do a project related to this topic? So it came from different spaces of how I built that agenda.
And I think that's a very for I've never really heard of it being more student driven. My advisor, when I started, he gave me the advice, what is going to be your first three single PI grants that you submit proposals? Like, what are your three best ideas, right? And so that was really my strategy. Was what basically I said to myself, I'm going to turn my first three ideas into career type young investigator awards, and that's basically essentially what I did in the first 2 years of academia. Was termed that those my three projects and kind of my research vision, into like you said, building on kind of your dissertation work mixed in with some different ideas, or things you weren't able to accomplish. And that was really my strategy for really building a research program. So it's really interesting to see
Hmm.
this kind of student driven one. And it's also the process of, like, it's just so many different ways to be an
Yeah.
academic and really build your research plan. I think people think, the way they may be doing it is very different, or wrong. And it's like, it's how you want to do it. I mean, it's really your domain, right? Like, you can choose to navigate it in any way that you feel. Kind of thinking about that, it is very stressful, especially in the beginning, like when you're trying to balance research, teaching service. You have when you really start to get students, it really gets more stressful because now you're having to guide them through it, and you have a deeper understanding of the topic, right? You're at the level where you know the fundamentals, and then you realize, like, students just don't, they're still developing. So the mentorship part is also kind of new. You're learning how to be a mentor to students with very different backgrounds and personalities. Like, was there ever a time, especially in the beginning, or any time in your assistant professorship or tenure process, that you felt overwhelmed, and how did you work through it?
Hmm. I did feel overwhelmed in some aspects. I think one of the times was in that first, of course, that first second year of all of the teaching changes, and the service overload changes. I think one of the more specifically teaching without a TA and a lecture style class was very stressful.
Yeah.
Um, and I made my life easier, navigated that by reducing my own, kind of lowering my own expectations of what a class needed to have in order for students to
Mm,
get away from it. So I reduced the number of assignments. I changed what was expected in terms of length of some of the assignments. And I think students probably liked that too, but it was
Of
great
course
for
they
me
did.
on the grading side. I also spent a lot of time redoing aspects of classes in the first year or so. And after that, moving on, decided to only make small tweaks moving forward. No big tweaks. And also giving myself a max time or time limit for course prep instead of saying, oh, I'll just prep this one lecture. I said, no, I will give myself 2 hours to prep this lecture. So because you could very easily spend 6 hours on one lecture trying to make the perfect slides, make the perfect assignment and discussion questions. And at the end of the day, students can only take away but so much from each class. So I think a lot of the overwhelming part was about teaching because it was so new. Research you've been doing
Right.
research maybe as an undergrad student for sure, since a PhD student. So for at least 4 years, you have been doing research. So you kind of know the flow and what's expected around these are the steps of the research process. This is where I can improve. Sure, I got a rejection, but I'll just resubmit it to something else. Teaching is a lot newer because you aren't really trained to teach as a PhD student, or oftentimes you are not, or you might have to go and seek that out through teaching centers on campus. But in terms of the amount of time that you spend as a PhD student teaching versus doing research, I mean, instructor of record teaching versus doing research, you're spending a significant more time doing research. So that research felt a little less overwhelming, and teaching was a bit more overwhelming to begin with.
Yeah, and I remember when I first started teaching, my first semester at OSU was January of spring 2021, so middle of COVID. And I remember calling a mentor and being like, I don't think I can do it. It took so much time. Like literally, as you were saying, you could spend you could spend an entire day. And I'm talking about from morning to like it's time to go to bed, like prepping a course, especially the first time you teach it. And you have to stay a little bit ahead of the students, right?
Right.
Because you need to know, a lot of us haven't looked at some of this material since we were an undergrad, right? Or since we were a first, second year grad student. So we're very far removed from some of the concepts. So sometimes you're having to teach yourself, right? Reteach yourself like what you knew a long time ago. So it can be very time consuming. I remember something I would do to your point of, blocking. I would block off every day like an hour and a half that I was going to dedicate to prepping for the class, because you start to see that you're not getting anything else done. And similar to you, I didn't have students the first year that I started. So you could easily, spend it. But when I got students, I was like, oh, I really cannot dedicate this amount of time to class prep because I have to mentor my students. Because that's the research is a big part, and you only are doing as good as your students are doing. So you really have to make sure that they are understanding how to do experiments, and all of those things. So how do you feel when it comes to, we talked a little bit about, establishing your research agenda, balancing teaching really being the part that, you know, takes the most time, especially in the beginning. When you started to apply to grants, and I'm sure as we all are, we're getting rejected. Like, how did you handle the rejection? Like, do you have any tips or strategies for how to handle rejections, whether it be from journals, grants, or even other opportunities that you might apply for, like awards?
Yes, rejection is a major part of the role. I think it depends on how you one so one you have to know your odds. And then
Mm,
two, it depends on how you frame rejection. So knowing the odds, when I applied for my very first NSF grant, I said, man, why is this not getting funded? I don't understand. And I think I resubmitted it and it did not get accepted then either. This was a collaborative grant with a colleague, and we were starting this new idea, and it was submitting to a division that was more in education than in like computer and information science and engineering, which who knows what is going on with NSF right now and their directorates. But
Yeah.
So there were lots of just norms that I didn't understand submitting to a different field of this federal funding space.
Yeah.
But also, someone told in the research office told me, "Oh, well, you know that there's only a 10% chance of getting these grants, right?" I said, "Oh, 10%. All right, I don't feel so bad now."
Yeah, it's hard.
I thought it was a 50% chance because you see all on social media now, LinkedIn, then Twitter, of everyone announcing all of their grants, announcements, and awards. And you think that it is more common than what it actually is until people started to share,
Yep.
oh, well, here's my screenshot of my funding portal. Look at all these other ones that were rejected
Yep.
before I got this one that was accepted. So once I started to know the odds, I said, oh, all right, this is just part of the job. If I'm in academia, I'm going to have to get used to rejection, not just for papers, which I was used to as a grad student, but also for grants as well, which has a lower acceptance rate than even these papers. And I'm more in a
Oh,
computer
yeah.
field where our conferences are more selective than our journals a lot of times. And so
Right.
the conference acceptance rate is about 20 to 25%. Said, all right, well, if I was used to that level of rejection in grad school for conference papers and now I'm at 10% for grants, then I just have to get used to this. So understanding my odds was important. And then also framing,
Mm.
because I don't want to say that I used writing grants to get feedback on the idea because that's a very long process to go through just to get feedback on something. But aspects of that process, like sending a one pager to a program
Hmm.
officer to get their feedback on that idea, was helpful. I also framed it as, all right, if this gets rejected, I will just reuse this grant for something else, which I had done. I think I gotten a grant through the Retirement Research Foundation, which was it was a previously rejected grant from something else. I don't remember what it was, but it's so similar that I could submit almost the same thing for this other funding agency. And I got that grant was awarded, right? So I think being able to reuse and only writing a grant for a project that I want to do anyway, was a helpful way to think about at least grant rejection. Paper rejection, I was already familiar with. Oh, there's another venue, there's another deadline. Let's read through these reviews, take a little bit of a break before after you get the reviews, and then read through the reviews, see which of these are just like the person didn't understand, or which of these are actually helpful to move forward the arguments being made in the paper, make those tweaks and resubmit it. You'd be surprised how often grant or papers are just resubmissions of other papers that had gotten rejected. So I think just the framing is part of the job, reuse, only submit it if, at least grant wise, if you plan to do it anyway.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a valid point of like social media. And I think we think about social media, we think about more personal things, but even in the professional world, like LinkedIn it can be dangerous, right? Because you see people post like, "Oh, I got this NSF career," but you don't know how many times they've submitted to that call, right? You have no idea how long it might have taken them 5 6 years to get this idea funded, and so you're only seeing the good, like you're not seeing the bad, which is why I have Dr. Professor Mom, because I want to be very honest, right, about the process of tenure in academia, and that it's hard to get an idea funded because for most agencies it's about 10%. I mean, it's not a lot of people are winning. I mean, in a single program, you may have 2 or 3 NSF career awards
Right.
for the year, right? So it's very the odds are definitely not in your favor, right? Like you're probably going to get rejected. And I also like the idea too of like you can use the feedback, right? I think one thing I enjoy about NSF is that they give very good in-depth feedback, and you can use that feedback to revamp your proposal or your idea, right, where there may be some gaps or some holes that you didn't think about, and submit to the same agency again, or take that proposal and submit it to
Well,
somewhere else. So I, there I think within LinkedIn can also be very dangerous. And the same way people take Instagram, Facebook, TikTok breaks, and like sometimes you may want to take, if a LinkedIn break, right? So that you can really focus on, and I think it's just so many people, so many of us, get into the comparison game of comparing ourselves to other people. But it's just very different. So we talked a lot about research, but we haven't really talked a lot about students. And so I wanted to ask you, like, what, when you look at, these last 5 years, what role did your students and the relationships and mentoring of them, how did that play a role in your journey so far?
Mentoring students is critical, right?
Mhm.
So when you're moving from the PhD student role to some type of role in academia, usually I'll say the tenure track role, you go from being the primary person doing the research as a student to more so advising people, students, on how to do that research. So there is a little bit of a role shift from
Yeah.
day to day, I'm going to be the one collecting all the data, to no, that's not very realistic once you think about all the other responsibilities that you have to do.
Yep.
You might be able to do that for one, maybe two projects a year, but at some point you have to switch over to this more mentor, advisor, manager style of role. And I think that is something that catches people a little bit off guard when they first start because they think they can still be the primary person. But at some point, you're going to have to mentor and advise students on how to do that work. But not only how to do the work, but how to communicate
Yep.
the work as well, because the whole goal of research is to disseminate it out for others to use. So you're going to be involved in these higher level discussions, maybe not doing all of the writing on the paper, but you might be advising students about what are the arguments, right, in this paper? What are the key takeaways? How can you make that clearer? So
Right.
I think mentoring students is valuable. It's certainly valuable for the tenure process because if you are funding, collecting data, advising on the writing of the paper, you will be a co-author on that paper, and that's something that is going to go into your tenure case as well.
Yeah.
So mentoring students is valuable for many reasons. I think just in general, mentoring students to me has more of a personal connection because someone mentored me when I was an undergrad, even an undergraduate student,
Yep.
right? So I try not to be that person that's like, oh, I'm not going to work with undergrad students. Undergrad students don't know anything. That's not true. And maybe when I started, I didn't know anything either. So I think it is important to invite students into meaningful aspects of research that might pique their interest because you never know where it's going to go. When I was an undergrad student, I was working with a PhD student on her dissertation work and helping her collect data, and she taught me how to analyze that data, which was super helpful. And I would not have gotten that from a traditional classroom experience. Even now, when I've only taught master's students so far, but at the end of the year, I say, oh, or the end of the semester, say, oh, what are your next steps, especially for those who are about to graduate? Say, oh, you should keep the PhD in mind. And everyone groans and rolls their eyes. They're like, no more school, right? And so I think in a classroom environment, it's very difficult to motivate people to see how fun research is, but in a research volunteer or paid hourly position, that's a lot easier to do. So I love mentoring students. I enjoy it.
So, have you had any situations where maybe you had to let a student go?
No, I haven't had to let. Is that true? No, I haven't. I haven't had to let a student go. I'm trying to think through all levels. So undergrad, no, they're usually in and out so fast. I usually don't put undergrad students. I put them on something that's important to the project, but not critically important. So
Right.
if they were to say, "Oh, I've got too many classes this semester," the hours that I thought at the beginning I can't do, I can only do these hours. It'll be fine. Same for master students, they're more short term. PhD students, I have had to say to a PhD student, like, hey, this research is not connected to the work that I do, so I won't be able to mentor you on it unless you change it to, I
Okay.
didn't say exactly what they had to change it to, but more so it has to be within the aging in disability space. If not, you might want to consider another advisor. And they ended up changing their work to fit the space very well, which I thought.
Okay.
And then so that's the only one I can think of at the PhD level. Postdoc level, there has been some conflict, but it wasn't like I have to let you go. It was more so these are the expectations. And a postdoc is very different for
Yep.
people who may not be aware. It's such a short term role. You want to make sure that the postdoc is getting something out of it very quickly. And you also want a return on your investment
Yep.
as well. So I said, hey, these are the expectations. If you can't meet them, I will be unable to renew
Yeah.
your position, right? So I have had to have that role, but ended up renewing their position. They didn't move forward with it, but it was a tough conversation to have because at the end of the day, the university is going to say, what are you funding this person to do? And if there is nothing there, they're going to ask you questions. Then you come under the
Yeah.
fire, whatever it might be. So I would say student wise, no, but postdocs have had to have one postdoc have had to have more of a difficult conversation.
And those conversations can be hard. I remember when I had to let a student go. This was in my third year. The student just, you know, what we do is what I do in my group is heavily experimental. And the student was definitely struggling to actually do the work. Like, not even just like a critical thinking, independent thinking definitely wasn't there, but they also just struggled to actually do the work. Like they couldn't do it. And for me, how I approach students is really in the first semester, I don't really have a ton of expectations. Even in the first year, I don't really have a ton of expectations. My thought process is the first semester, just like we have to learn how to transition and balance like teaching and service and research, they also have to learn how to balance it as well. So the first semester, I go, it's going to be a wash, right? You're have classes, you're learning, the work is different. You're learning research, you learn how to do research, you're learning how to do experiments, you're learning how to do microscopy. So I give them like the first semester I don't expect, and I meet with every one of my students weekly. Each student week. Oh yeah, I know. Each student weekly. I have to, it helps me do it. And people are always like, that's a lot of meetings. It is.
Well,
But it helps me stay on top of them and on top of what's going on. But the second semester, especially when we get into the middle of it, I'm expecting to see that you're learning the techniques that you're having to use. You're starting to generate some data, whether that be fatigue data, micro images, like you are starting to generate some data, right? There's some level of understanding, because my thought is in the summer, after between the first and second year, is really where you're going to pick up steam, because you don't have classes, right? And this student specifically just couldn't do the work experimentally. They couldn't, like, I always give the analogy, like when you go to a microscope's expensive. Like, what are you going there to do? Like, what is your goal here, right? Is your goal here to look at this, understand this, and then that should guide how the session is going to go. And it takes time to learn the instrument. There's value in learning the instrument. This student just refused to learn how the instrument works. And so they would go to the microscope and the images just, it would be like, well, what did you go for? And so I was like, similar to you, I set them down. I said, hey, I don't think this is the right fit. There are many other advisors. Our material science program is very large. I think there are other advisors that your talents they could benefit from. But in my group, I just don't think it's the right fit. I don't think you're getting a lot out of this, and I'm not getting a lot out of this. And I think it, would be better if you find a different advisor. And I just told them that.
and that's
That
a conversation, right? That you're probably not used to having. I'm trying to see if I can find. I don't know. I think it might be on campus. This book that I'm thinking of. The book is literally called Crucial Conversations, and it was very helpful for me to guide that conversation with the postdoc because I didn't want it to make it seem like, oh, you're not a good
Right.
person,
That's
right?
right.
Like you're not smart. You have a PhD. We know you can do things, but it's more so something isn't working, and we need to figure out what it is. Can we come together to figure out what that is? So
Right.
sometimes the suggestion is maybe you need to work with somebody else and not with me. Maybe this
And
is
that's literally what I said. I was like, I don't think I'm the right person, and I don't think the research, because the a lot of the research that I do is fundamental, and it requires a lot of critical thinking and independent thinking.
mm-hmm.
Like when remember I had a student. The student came to me. They were heat treating a piece of metal in the furnace, and when they practiced the heat treatment, they practiced on something this small. But when the actual thing they were heat treating was this large, so I said, "Hey, how long did you have it in the furnace for?" They were like 10 minutes, and I said, "Oh, well, it wouldn't have reached." I said, "Did it reach temperature in 10 minutes?" And they're like, "Well, the one I practiced on, it did." And I said, "Yeah, but you practice on something really tiny, right? This is much larger. It's more material, right? So it's gonna take it longer to reach." So it was things like that where it was like, okay, like there's like the ability to kind of critically think, and I can't be in like you said, there's no way I can be in the lab with you, watching over your shoulder. And so, it was also putting a strain. And another thing we don't think about is how is the specific person influencing the other students in the lab? Because if now all of the other students are having to give their time and attention to helping this one student, then it's pulling them away from their research. So the dynamic is changing. And so I think too, you do have to have, that's why I always tell people, don't be in a rush to get a student. It's better to wait a year and get a really good student than take a really bad student in the first year.
Exactly. I completely agree because it could be a very major fit disconnect. And similarly, I think there was a fit disconnect and maybe an expectation disconnect with the postdoc that I'm referencing because I was, we had a conversation and I said, all right, these are the expectations for the first year, and then these will be the expectations for the second year. Start to work on second year things in the first year. And I remember them telling me, I don't multitask. I said,
Oh.
oh, this will be difficult then. I see the issue of
See
why
what's happening.
we're having the problem because being unable,
Hmm.
there's unable and unwilling. I don't know
That's
which
right.
one it was. But not multitasking in an academic role when you are then saying you are planning to apply for academic roles, that's not really going to work. And so maybe in your next position, because maybe at this time we have both known that we were going separate ways. So maybe in your next position, think about how you might figure out how to multitask or some strategies towards slowly easing into multitasking. And I had this
Yeah.
conversation with that person's future boss as well because I knew their future boss, and I said, "Hey, this was an issue for me. Um, Working with this individual, maybe you have some better strategies than what I did to try to support easing into multitasking, just so everybody is supportive in this process of let's try to make it work as much as possible." So maybe it's just the fit thing.
Yeah, and I think people, especially junior faculty, and I think it sometimes can be harder for female faculty to let students go because you feel like, well, I should be able to not I should be able to kind of nurture them through the process, and it's like, well, that's not your job, right? Like
Right.
the nurturing part, that is not a part of the job, right? Like every student, there, like you said, there has to be expectations, right? There has to be a standard in the lab and how things go. And for me too, with students, I have to trust the integrity of your work. And that's a big thing as an experimentalist, right? When I no longer can trust what you're showing me. And again, then it requires other students and me to having to have more role. And I think those conversations can be difficult to have, but you're only going to be doing as good as your students are doing, and that's such it's so bad. And even now, like when we have new faculty and they're having issues with a student, I'm like, hey, this is my thought process. When I had to let a student go, and a lot of it is just like fit. Like, I've had students, say things like, I have to cook and clean. It's like, okay, well, I have a 2-year-old.
Okay. We
I
all
take care,
things.
right, take care of a whole another person, right? So
You
I
bring
just,
up a good point about the nurturing aspect because I think women faculty have this expectation placed upon them that they are going to be the ones to go to whenever a student is having a
yep,
problem. They can come and cry in your office or complain about this person in your office. And at some point, you kind of have to set the boundaries around that. I recently had a situation where someone was coming and like telling me way too many personal details, and I was
yeah,
like, you might need to go to HR, or you
okay,
might go to the counseling folks on campus or
yeah.
refer to this document because all I have are these tissues and I cannot help you beyond this. So that's
No, I
something to be very mindful of for female faculty because your male counterparts and colleagues often do not even have a tissue box in their office, right? They don't have people coming to them with these types of issues. Now, there are some exceptions, but not many.
Yeah, and as you said before, I think students have the expectation that the female faculty member is going to be nurturing.
Mhm.
And like I always say, I'm not your mom.
Right.
I'm
I'm
just not, I'm
not
not.
a nurturer. If you are coming to me with, oh, I need to quit the program, okay. Like, what am I going to do? This is your opinion. This is your life. Now I will give advice. I'll be like,
Yeah,
oh,
you get it, but
try this,
also
try that. But at the end of the day, I am not the one making the decision.
no. And to your point too, it's time consuming. If I have every student coming to me every time there's a problem in their life that are not even my students, and that's an extra burden that it's extra work that I'm doing that my male colleague next to me is not having to do, right? And I think another part to that is when students, especially students that you teach, I mean, even sometimes your research students, anytime they come to you and you're not nurturing, they feel like it's a personal attack. And you're like, well, that's not a part of my job, right? Like my job is to guide, mentor, and advise you, right? My job is not to sit there and listen to, you know, you broke up with your significant other or, those things. While I can if, let's say you're like I give my students self-care days, right? And they don't even have to tell me why, right? They just say I'm taking a self-care day. No questions asked. But if I have a student that might share with me, well, this happened and I can, I have like a day or two, sure, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But I can't fix your relationship problems. And my mom actually was helpful for in that because I remember she would say, Ariel, you are not, my mom is a counselor. So she would say, Ariel, you are not a mental health professional. Like, you should not be giving out any mental health advice. Like, aren't there not facilities or departments that they can go services? Like, yeah, there are plenty of services. She's like, that is where you need to direct them because you should not be giving out any type of mental health.
Because if you ask me, I'm going to rely on what I know, which is Real Housewives of Atlanta, which does not work at all. It never works. Let's all just sit down and hash out your problems together in a public environment. That's not going to work. So don't ask me.
Okay. Don't ask me. It's true though. And that's literally like you said, it's like, well, and when she said that to me, like, she was like, you're not even qualified to be giving out any type of mental health advice. You should not be doing that. And I was like, you know what? You are right. Like, I should not be doing this. After that, I literally will send them, we call out, I will send them the caps information. Like, this is how you schedule an appointment. Like, I have like a draft email now that I send. Like, this is what you do. But it doesn't mean that we don't care. I don't care about my students, and I have had students that have had traumatic things happen to them while they're in my class, and they may come to me, and say, hey, my mom died, or my dad died, or I've had students say, I worked 3 jobs to pay for college, and
Mhm.
I missed the assignment, and I'm always willing to help any student 100%. But I'm also not a mental health professional. And it's like you said, it's the boundary, right? You have to, and I think in the beginning, you just want to help everybody. It's that yes thing, saying yes to everything. You don't all, I remember I said to a friend, I was literally holding my urine for 8 hours because students kept coming in. I was like, "Oh well, okay, yeah, just come in." This is like my first real, I would say my real year when things were in person, and I was like, "Why the heck am I holding?"
Right. Well, one, that is impressive. 8 hours.
I did, and I was like, "Is this crazy?" But it's like in the beginning, you feel like you need to please in the sense of like making everyone else happy, and it just comes with the territory. So another question I want to ask you before our time runs out is how has your identity, your values, or your lived experiences really shaped your identity as a professor and the way you approach the job, I would say.
That is a great question. Well, one, I can think about identity. Um,
Mm-hmm.
for me, I'm very Issa, rooting for everybody Black. I always want to see other Black people succeed. So
Mm-hmm.
I make time for that in both service and research, really. So service wise, um, I'll almost to a fault, I will say yes to most mentoring things of
Okay.
people of color, right? But
Mm-hmm.
that's because it's something that I enjoy doing. I've also made time for supporting Black people in the community in my research by partnering and continuing a multi-year partnership at this time with an organization focused on Black people over the age of 60 in Detroit. And I always return
Okay.
to present work or recruit or volunteer. And when I was so I did a visiting researcher position at Google. I said, hey, Google can pay you all a lot more money than I can. So I made sure to go through the legal process so that they could be a community partner with Google and then get more funding and more visibility
Mm,
for their work, right? So I'm always going to make time for Black people. Right?
okay.
In terms of lived experience, how that has impacted my approach, I think I have seen, whether it's from in my own family, usually actually a lot in my own family, other colleagues around me, when they retire, they're usually so exhausted that they don't
Yeah.
do the things that they find enjoyable, or maybe they have health conditions where they can no
Yep.
longer do that thing. So I said, I do not want to be that person, right? I
Yeah.
want to do the things that I find enjoyable now. I don't want to have to wait. Some people say, oh, I'll wait until after tenure. I did not
Yep.
wait, right? Or I'll wait until I'm full professor. It's always going to be something else. Or I'll wait until I'm retired. And then by that time, it could be too late. So I make sure if I want to go on that trip, I'm going on that trip. I'll let
That's
my
right.
know, hey, this is a no contact time. Get everything you need from me before this time, and then I'll be back. Same for you. If you need to go on a vacation and you don't want anybody to contact you, just let us know. We'll schedule the
Mm-hmm.
email for when you come back, or just wait till you come back, whatever it is. So I think that has informed my approach to not just the work, but
Yep.
taking breaks from the work too.
And I like that you said that. I agree with you. It was the same when I decided to have my son, and I talked to, different female faculty that I knew across many different institutions at many different levels, whether it was associate, full, dean, whatever. And every single one of them said it's always going to be something, right? There's never a perfect time. And my main mentor, Michelle Manuel, looked at me and said, I'm just going to tell you that this is a young person's game. Chasing behind a child is not for an older person. You should do it while you're young. I think all of them said that, right? There's never going to be a perfect time to have a child. You could think it's the perfect time and then boom, right? You could lose funding, or you could get in a space where you need to hire more students. Right now you have more responsibility. So there's just never going to be a perfect time. And also, like, this job is only going to go for so long, right? Like, what is going to be your life outside of this, right? Having kids, that's a totally different, life, And so for me, having children was important. It's having one, I should say, is important, was important for me. And I think, like you said, there's really just never a perfect time. You have to do what you're comfortable with. And I think too, I like that you're motivated so much from like your background and your experiences and what you find important. And I don't think there's absolutely anything wrong with that. I always say, like, you should always be looking at like where your passion and purpose intersect, right? Like, and that should align, right, very well. And it's good when you're living a fulfilled life, those two are going to align. And I had never did that before. I've never taken a spring break. Robin, you're really good about this. I've never taken a spring break the entire time I've been at OSU. So this
Oh my
past,
goodness.
never did it. Always worked through spring break. It's crazy. Always worked through spring break. And this year, I had a pretty rough 2024 with postpartum and with my mom's health. And I was like, I'm taking this spring break. Actually, it always usually falls on my birthday. So it's like, I'm taking spring break. And I told my students, you only contact me if this lab is burning down. I don't even care if the building's on fire. If our lab is not in the line of fire, do not call me.
Mhm.
Like, that's literally what I said to them, and they were like, okay. And I had never, they always can text me, always can call me. And that was the
Cell phone number?
they do.
Ma'am, clutching all of these pearls. Oh my gosh.
They
Okay.
have my number. They can text me. They run an experiment. Even like it could be like, because we do a lot of in situ overnight microscopy experiments. I've had students like text me 11 midnight. I'm like, text me anytime. I'm always and that's the thing. I'm always available. But then I was like, I am very exhausted. I'm very tired, and I need a mental break. Right. So my son went and stayed with my mom, and I went, and had a vacation. I was like, don't contact me. And I think, it brings up that what you said is like, I want to enjoy my life. And with my mom's situation, it really taught me how short life really can be and how quickly you can go from walking and being okay to not okay. And so really making sure, and I think that's the thriving part in academia, right? Is you don't want to just be surviving. That is going to be hell, right? Like, if you're just in survival mode for 5 years,
Mhm.
that's not you're not gonna enjoy it, right? That's not the way you want to me. You want to live your life. So I really like that point of really wanting to enjoy your life. So the last question, we'll have two more questions. The next to the last question is, if you could give one piece of advice to new assistant professors, what would it be?
One thing. Right.
Just
So as an
one.
assistant professor, you're going to get a lot of advice. Everybody's going to have an opinion. That is not my advice. Okay. So the one piece of advice I would say, in line with what we have discussed today, is to define what working style is best for you.
Mm,
Not what works for your advisor, not what works for other people in your school or department. So define what that working style is for you and be sure that it provides time for you to do something outside of your work. As we've been saying, we recognize your job is likely something you enjoy, something you find exciting, but
yeah.
it should not be your identity because, as we're seeing now, jobs are here one day and gone the next, or funding is here one day and gone the next, or, potentially you're here one day, you're gone the next. They will replace you very quickly. So it should not be your identity. Find some things outside of job in that working schedule you have.
Okay. So last question. Now that you've gone through the tenure process, you've achieved tenure, what's next for you? Like, what excites you about the future? Like, what's going to be next?
So there's some very practical things that are
Mhm.
next. Research wise, I think I am a little over publications, right? I
Okay.
see how insular they are to the community. They don't really get out and make the impact that I really want to have. So I've been trying to think about ways to better influence policy and use
Mm,
publications at a higher level. Now, maybe not federal policy, especially with our current circumstance, but maybe local or state or advocacy
yeah.
organizations. How can my research push their agendas forward in some way? So I think that is one thing that I would like to do, between now and maybe full professor. Who knows?
Right.
Um, Other more immediate things. So once you go up for tenure, either right after that or soon after that, you're in line for a sabbatical. So I will be taking that sabbatical, using it as a time for rest to an extent.
Okay.
As this upcoming, we have the summer, then this upcoming semester in the fall, I'll be on maternity leave, having a first little one, which is exciting. And then my sabbatical is technically starting that January. So it's very nice in that semester ended April of 2025, and I am not teaching again until August of 2026. And it's fully paid, so I'm gonna rest as much as possible between now and little one. And then, motherly duties kick in, which will be a lot of excitement and learning new things. So,
Yes, and I'm so excited for you becoming a mom. It's so much fun. I mean, in the beginning, it's rough when you, I'm not gonna lie, especially when you return. I always say when you were that's first semester, when you have to balance like motherhood with this job.
yeah.
The first 3 months, you're like, woo.
Okay. I am trying to mentally prepare, but I feel like nothing can actually mentally prepare you.
Nothing can prepare you. I'm serious. Like you literally are like it is the definition of running around like a chicken with its head, its head cut off. Like you're like, I'm just gonna see how it goes today. I have this meme I'm gonna send you of like I'm going with the flow, and what the flow was terrible. So yeah, it's the first 3 months are like, and then you get into a groove, and you have to set boundaries with your students because you have a child,
Right.
right? But it's a lot of fun. So I'm super excited. I'm excited to see you become a mom, and Monsa needs a friend. I say it all the time. Like none of my academic colleagues have kids, but you guys, Monsa needs a friend.
Bring them out. We are always here. Rochelle will probably try to pick him up a million times and tire himself out again.
You know it. You know it. So before we end, is there anything like any parting advice, anything you want to say before we go?
One thing I will say is that this was another part of advice where it's hard to give one piece of advice. It is related though in terms of managing your own sanity and your own time. I think there's a tendency for us as academics or overachievers in some sense to make a to-do list, and that whether that's for the day, the week, the semester, and try to check everything off. You will be fine if you do not check everything off of
That's
the
real.
list. That is basically, if you check everything off, that just clears up space to add more things. So the work will not run out. So do not feel this urgency to check everything
That's real.
off of your list. But other than that, you'll do fine, have fun with it, and here as a resource if folks ever want to connect.
Okay, Robin, thank you so much for joining this discussion on Dr. Professor Mom. To everyone watching or listening on Apple Podcasts, feel free to subscribe. You can leave any comments. If you have any questions, I'll get them to Robin in any way. But thank you guys so much for listening and tuning in. And thank you, Robin. Thank you for
Thank
talking today.
you.